why America's military history still shapes the world today. This is American Global Force. Subscribe and share, because what you are about to hear is not just the story of battles, weapons, or military victories. It is the story of how the military history of the United States quietly reshaped the modern world in ways most people never fully realize. Because every time you hear about global alliances, military bases, naval fleets crossing oceans, or powerful nations reacting to American decisions, you are witnessing the consequences of a history built over centuries of war, strategy, sacrifice, and ambition. And that should make you stop and ask yourself one important question. How did one nation become so influential that its military history still affects politics, economics, and security across nearly every region of Earth today? To understand this, you must go back to the very beginning, long before America became a superpower, long before advanced aircraft carriers and global military bases, back to a time when the future of the United States itself was uncertain, because America was born through conflict during the American Revolutionary War, a struggle against one of the most powerful empires of the 18th century, United Kingdom. And this war shaped the nation's mindset forever, because from the very start, Americans learned something dangerous and powerful. Determined military resistance could challenge even the strongest empire in the world. And that belief became deeply embedded in the country's identity. But what makes American military history so influential is not simply that the country fought wars. Nearly every major nation has done that. It is the scale of transformation that followed those conflicts, because each major war pushed the United States into a larger role globally, expanding its economy, strengthening its military, and increasing its international influence. And slowly, almost step by step, America moved from survival to dominance, from defending itself to shaping the international order itself. One of the first major turning points came during the American Civil War, a brutal conflict that nearly destroyed the nation from within, yet unexpectedly transformed it into an industrial and military giant, because the war forced massive advancements in transportation, weapons production, communication systems, and military organization. And by the time it ended, the United States possessed industrial capabilities unlike anything it had before. And this is important because modern military power depends heavily on industrial strength, logistics, and technology, lessons America learned painfully but effectively during that war. As the 19th century continued, America expanded westward, strengthened economically, and began increasing its military capabilities. But for many years, it still avoided deep involvement in global conflicts, protected by oceans and focused mainly on internal growth. And then something changed forever. The Spanish-American War, the forgotten war that transformed America from a continental nation into an international power. Because after defeating Spain, the United States gained overseas territories, expanded its navy, and realized it could project military power across oceans. And from that moment onward, America no longer saw itself as isolated from world affairs. Think carefully about how dangerous that realization was, because once a nation understands it has the ability to influence distant regions militarily, its ambitions often begin expanding rapidly. And this is exactly what happened during the 20th century, as American military power grew alongside economic strength, creating a combination few nations in history had ever achieved at such scale. Then came the global conflicts that would permanently reshape the modern world, especially World War I and World War II. And this is where America's military history truly began, shaping the future of humanity itself, because during these wars, the United States did not simply participate. It became one of the central forces determining the outcome of global events. And after World War II, the world entered an entirely new era where American military, economic, and political influence became interconnected on an unprecedented level. What makes World War II especially important is that it transformed America into something the world had never seen before, a superpower with unmatched industrial capacity, enormous military reach, and global alliances stretching across continents. And this changed international politics permanently, because after the war, many nations depended on American military protection, economic support, or strategic partnerships for survival and stability. And this is one reason why American military history still matters today, because many modern alliances and defense systems were built directly from the outcomes of those conflicts. Then came the Cold War, a period where the world lived under constant tension between the United States and the Soviet Union. And unlike previous wars, this struggle was not fought primarily through direct large-scale battles between the two powers. Instead, it involved nuclear deterrence, espionage, proxy wars, military alliances, technological competition, and ideological influence across the globe. And this period shaped modern military strategy more than almost any other era in history because nations realized future wars could threaten the survival of humanity itself. The Cold War also explains why the United States maintains military bases and alliances around the world today. Because during that period, America built enormous defense networks designed to contain Soviet influence. And even after the Soviet Union collapsed, many of those systems remained, continuing to shape global security decades later. And this raises an important question. Once a superpower creates a worldwide military presence, can it ever truly withdraw from global responsibility again? Another reason America's military history still shapes the world today is technological innovation. Because many modern technologies developed directly or indirectly from military competition, including radar systems, satellites, advanced aviation, cybersecurity infrastructure, and even parts of the internet itself. And this shows something fascinating about military history. Wars often accelerate technological change faster than peaceful periods do, though usually at enormous human cost. At the same time, American military interventions in places like Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan influenced global politics for generations, shaping how nations think about intervention, counterinsurgency, alliances, and power projection. And regardless of whether people support or criticize those conflicts, their impact on international relations remains enormous, because every major military action sends signals to allies, rivals, and future generations watching closely. But perhaps the most astonishing part of all this is psychological influence, because American military history shaped global expectations about power itself, creating the widespread belief that when major crises erupt, the United States will likely become involved in some form, whether through military deployment, diplomacy, economic pressure, or alliances, and that expectation alone affects how nations behave internationally. And yet behind all this power remains a deeper question many people still debate today. Has America's military influence created greater global stability, or has it increased international tension by placing too much power in one nation's hands? Because depending on where you stand in the world, the answer may sound completely different. As this first chapter closes, think carefully about what we have uncovered, because the story of American military history is not just about the past. It is about understanding why the modern world operates the way it does right now. And in the next chapter, we will reveal how America's rise after World War II transformed global politics forever and created a military system so powerful that its influence can still be felt in nearly every corner of the planet today. This is American Global Force. Subscribe and share, because what happened after World War II changed the world forever. And if you truly want to understand why America's military history still shapes global politics today, then you must understand this critical moment, because periods do, though usually at enormous human cost. At the same time, American military interventions in places like Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan influenced global politics for generations, shaping how nations think about intervention, counterinsurgency, alliances, and power projection. And regardless of whether people support or criticize those conflicts, their impact on international relations remains enormous, because every major military action sends signals to allies, rivals, and future generations watching closely. But perhaps the most astonishing part of all this is psychological influence, because American military history shaped global expectations about power itself, creating the widespread belief that when major crises erupt, the United States will likely become involved in some form, whether through military deployment, diplomacy, economic pressure, or alliances, and that expectation alone affects how nations behave internationally. And yet behind all this power remains a deeper question many people still debate today. Has America's military influence created greater global stability, or has it increased international tension by placing too much power in one nation's hands? Because depending on where you stand in the world, the answer may sound completely different. As this first chapter closes, think carefully about what we have uncovered, because the story of American military history is not just about the past. It is about understanding why the modern world operates the way it does right now. And in the next chapter, we will reveal how America's rise after World War II transformed global politics forever and created a military system so powerful that its influence can still be felt in nearly every corner of the planet today. This is American Global Force. Subscribe and share, because what happened after World War II changed the world forever. And if you truly want to understand why America's military history still shapes global politics today, then you must understand this critical moment. Because before the war, the United States was already powerful. But after the war, it emerged as something completely different. A military and economic giant with influence stretching across continents, oceans, and political systems. And what makes this even more astonishing is that much of the modern international order was built directly around American military strength, alliances, and strategy. When World War II began in 1939, much of Europe and Asia quickly descended into chaos, with aggressive powers expanding rapidly, governments collapsing, and millions of people suddenly trapped in brutal conflict. But at first, the United States remained cautious about direct involvement, partly because memories of World War I still haunted many Americans who feared another devastating overseas war, and yet behind the scenes, America was already preparing industrially and militarily, increasing weapons production and supporting allies through programs like Lend-Lease. And this is important because it revealed something the world would soon fully understand. America's industrial capacity alone was becoming a weapon powerful enough to shape global outcomes. Then came the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, a moment that shocked the nation and instantly transformed American public opinion, because overnight, the United States shifted from cautious observer to fully mobilized military power. And what followed was one of the largest military expansions in human history, with factories producing tanks, aircraft, ships, ammunition, and supplies at extraordinary speed, while millions of soldiers entered training. And suddenly America became not only a participant in the war, but the industrial engine driving Allied resistance across multiple continents. What makes this transformation so historically significant is the scale, because by the middle of the war, the United States was fighting simultaneously in Europe, the Pacific, North Africa, and across the oceans themselves, coordinating enormous military operations that required unprecedented logistics, communication systems, and strategic planning. And this demonstrated something no nation could ignore anymore. America possessed the ability to project military power globally on a scale almost unmatched in history. In Europe, American troops fought alongside allies against Germany under Adolf Hitler, while in the Pacific, American forces battled the expanding empire of Japan. And these campaigns were not only brutal, but technologically transformative, because the war accelerated advancements in aviation, radar, naval warfare, medicine, intelligence gathering, and communications. And many of the technologies shaping modern life today evolved directly from wartime innovation during this period. Perhaps one of the most important military moments came during the Normandy landings, commonly known as D-Day, when Allied forces launched one of the largest amphibious invasions in history. And this operation showed the world the sheer organizational and military strength America had developed, because coordinating ships, aircraft, troops, supplies, and intelligence on such scale required enormous power and planning capability. And from that point onward, it became increasingly clear that the United States would emerge from the war as one of the dominant forces shaping the post-war world. Then came the end of the war, and one of the most controversial moments in military history, the use of atomic bombs against Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And regardless of how people view that decision today, its impact on global politics was immediate and enormous. Because for the first time, humanity witnessed a weapon capable of destroying entire cities within moments. And suddenly military history entered the nuclear age, an age where future wars carried the possibility of civilization itself being destroyed. This single development permanently changed global strategy, because after 1945, military power was no longer measured only by soldiers, ships, or territory. It became tied to nuclear capability and deterrence, and the United States stood at the center of this new reality, possessing unmatched military and economic influence, while much of Europe and Asia lay devastated by war. But here is where America's military history became even more influential, because instead of withdrawing completely after victory, the United States helped build a new international system designed to prevent another world war, supporting reconstruction efforts, forming military alliances, and maintaining overseas bases to secure global stability. And this led directly to organizations and agreements that still shape international relations today, including NATO, which became one of the most powerful military alliances in modern history. The creation of NATO revealed another major shift in American military thinking, because for much of its early history, the United States avoided permanent foreign alliances. But after World War II, leaders believed isolation was no longer possible in a world threatened by ideological rivalry, nuclear weapons, and global instability. And this marked the beginning of America's long-term role as a global security leader. At the same time, tensions with the Soviet Union rapidly increased, beginning the Cold War, a conflict unlike any before it. Because instead of direct world war, the two superpowers competed through military buildups, espionage, technological races, propaganda, and proxy wars across different regions, and this period deeply shaped modern military systems, intelligence operations, and international diplomacy. One reason America's military history still influences the world today is because many modern global tensions originated during the Cold War era, including alliances in Europe, military positions in Asia, and security arrangements in the Middle East. And even after the Soviet Union collapsed, these systems largely remained in place, continuing to influence international politics decades later. Meanwhile, American culture itself became closely tied to military identity during this period, with veterans returning home as heroes, defense industries expanding massively, and military innovation influencing science, education, and technology nationwide. And this created what some leaders later called the military-industrial complex, a powerful connection between defense spending, politics, industry, and national strategy. But perhaps the most astonishing reality is this. After World War II, the world increasingly expected America to respond whenever major crises erupted, whether through military force, economic aid, alliances, or diplomatic pressure. And that expectation still shapes global politics today, because many nations continue looking toward Washington during international emergencies, conflicts, or security threats. As this chapter closes, ask yourself one chilling question. If World War II transformed America into the central military power of the modern world, what happens when a nation becomes so influential that global stability itself begins depending on its decisions? Because in the next chapter, we will uncover how the Cold War pushed humanity to the edge of destruction, and why America's military strategies during that terrifying era still affect the modern world today. This is American Global Force. Subscribe and share because after World War II ended, many people believed peace had finally arrived, but instead humanity entered one of the most dangerous periods in history, a time when the world lived under the constant fear of nuclear annihilation. And at the center of that terrifying era stood the United States, whose military decisions, alliances, and strategies would shape global politics for generations. And this is where America's military history became more influential than ever before. Because during the Cold War, the future of the planet itself often seemed balanced on the edge of destruction. The Cold War began almost immediately after World War II, as tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union rapidly intensified. Because although both nations had fought against Nazi Germany, they viewed the future of the world very differently, with America supporting capitalist democracy while the Soviet Union promoted communist expansion. And this ideological rivalry soon became a global struggle for influence, power, and survival. And what made it so frightening was that both sides possessed enormous military strength, combined with nuclear weapons capable of wiping out entire cities within minutes. Think carefully about how terrifying this reality was, because, for the first time in human history, nations possessed weapons powerful enough to destroy civilization itself. And suddenly, military history entered a completely new era where wars were no longer only about armies invading territory. They became psychological battles involving deterrence, espionage, propaganda, technological competition, and the constant threat of mutual destruction. And this changed international relations forever. One of the most important military strategies developed during this period was nuclear deterrence. The idea that possessing devastating weapons could actually prevent war because both sides feared catastrophic retaliation. And while this strategy may sound logical on the surface, it created a horrifying situation where global peace depended partly on the fear of total destruction. And this raises an uncomfortable question. Can humanity truly feel safe when survival depends on nations refusing to press buttons capable of ending millions of lives? During the Cold War, the United States rapidly expanded its military systems, building nuclear submarines, strategic bomber fleets, intercontinental ballistic missiles, aircraft carriers, and intelligence networks across the globe. And at the same time, the Soviet Union did the same, creating an arms race unlike anything the world had ever seen, with each side constantly trying to outmatch the other technologically and militarily. And this competition affected nearly every part of society, from scientific research to education, because military superiority became directly connected to national survival. One of the most dangerous moments of the entire Cold War came during the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the world came terrifyingly close to nuclear war. Because after discovering Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba, American leaders demanded their removal, while military forces on both sides prepared for possible conflict. And for several days, humanity watched anxiously as two nuclear superpowers stood on the brink of catastrophic war. And many historians still believe this was the closest the modern world has ever come to total nuclear disaster. Imagine the fear during those days, families listening to emergency broadcasts, governments preparing shelters, military commanders waiting for orders, and ordinary people wondering whether civilization itself might end within hours, because this crisis revealed something terrifying about global military power. Even one mistake, misunderstanding, or emotional decision could potentially trigger worldwide catastrophe. Although direct war between the United States and the Soviet Union never officially occurred, the Cold War spread across the globe through proxy conflicts, where both superpowers supported opposing sides in regional wars, and this led to devastating conflicts in places like Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, and parts of Latin America and Africa. And these wars deeply shaped international politics while also influencing military doctrine, counterinsurgency tactics, intelligence operations, and global alliances for decades afterward. The Vietnam War became especially important because it revealed the limits of military power even for a superpower as strong as the United States. And despite enormous resources and advanced weapons, America struggled against guerrilla tactics, difficult terrain, and political complications. And this war changed how military leaders thought about intervention, public opinion, and modern warfare itself. Meanwhile, the Cold War also accelerated technological innovation at extraordinary speed because competition between the United States and Soviet Union pushed advancements in space exploration, satellites, computers, communications, aviation, and surveillance systems. And many technologies people use today evolved partly from military research during this rivalry, proving once again how military history often shapes civilian life in unexpected ways. Another reason America's military history during the Cold War still affects the modern world is the network of alliances and overseas bases created during this era because the United States established military partnerships across Europe, Asia, and the Middle East to contain Soviet influence. And even after the Soviet Union collapsed, many of these alliances remained active, continuing to influence global politics and security arrangements today. At the same time, American intelligence agencies expanded dramatically during the Cold War, conducting espionage operations, covert missions, and strategic surveillance worldwide, and this created a hidden dimension of military influence, where information became almost as powerful as weapons themselves. And this shift toward intelligence-driven warfare still shapes modern conflicts in the digital age. But perhaps the most fascinating part of the Cold War is that despite decades of tension, enormous military buildups, and countless crises, the United States and Soviet Union avoided direct nuclear war, and some historians argue that deterrence succeeded in preventing global catastrophe, while others believe humanity survived partly through luck, careful diplomacy, and moments of restraint during extremely dangerous situations. When the Soviet Union finally collapsed in 1991, the Cold War officially ended, leaving the United States as the world's dominant superpower. But the systems, strategies, alliances, and military structures built during that era did not disappear. Instead, they continued shaping international politics long afterward, influencing everything from NATO expansion to modern cybersecurity and counterterrorism operations. And now think about this carefully. Even today, many global tensions can trace their origins back to decisions made during the Cold War. Because military alliances, regional rivalries, and strategic fears created during that era still affect how nations interact right now, proving once again that America's military history is not trapped in the past. It continues shaping the present in ways many people barely notice. As this chapter closes, ask yourself one chilling question. If humanity survived decades of nuclear tension once before, what lessons from the Cold War are world leaders remembering today? And more importantly, which lessons might they already be forgetting? Because in the next chapter, we will uncover how America's military interventions after the Cold War reshaped the modern Middle East and changed global security forever. This is American Global Force. Subscribe and share. Because after the Cold War ended, many people believed the world was finally entering a more peaceful era, but instead the United States found itself facing a completely new kind of global challenge, one that would reshape military strategy, international politics, and global security for decades. And this challenge emerged most powerfully in the Middle East, where American military interventions after the Cold War changed governments, redrew alliances, and created consequences still affecting the world today. And if you truly want to understand why America's military history continues shaping global events, you must understand what happened during these conflicts and why their impact never fully disappeared. The first major turning point came in 1990 when Iraq under Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, shocking the international community and threatening one of the world's most important oil-producing regions. And suddenly the United States faced a critical decision. Should it intervene militarily in a region thousands of miles away to defend international stability and strategic interests, or should it avoid another major overseas conflict after decades of Cold War tension? And this moment revealed something important about post-Cold War America, because by then much of the world expected the United States to act whenever major international crises emerged. Under President George H.W. Bush, America built a massive international coalition and launched the Gulf War, and what followed stunned military observers worldwide. Because American-led forces defeated Iraq's military with overwhelming speed and technological superiority, using precision airstrikes, advanced communications, satellite guidance systems, and coordinated ground operations unlike anything previously seen on such scale. And this war introduced the modern image of high-tech American warfare to the world. The Gulf War also transformed global perceptions of American military dominance after the Cold War, because many nations realized the United States possessed not only enormous military power, but also the technological capability to conduct rapid global operations with extraordinary precision. And this reinforced America's position as the dominant military force of the post-Soviet era. But it also raised another important question. When one nation becomes overwhelmingly powerful militarily, how does that change the balance of global politics itself? Yet despite the military victory, new tensions continued growing across the Middle East, partly because American involvement in the region increased dramatically after the Gulf War, including military bases, sanctions, alliances, and long-term strategic commitments. And while some governments welcomed American protection, others viewed the growing presence with suspicion or hostility, creating a complicated relationship that would eventually explode into even larger conflicts. Then came September 11, 2001, one of the most shocking moments in modern American history, when terrorists associated with al-Qaeda attacked the United States, destroying the World Trade Center towers and striking the Pentagon, killing thousands and instantly transforming global security forever. And this attack did more than trigger grief and anger. It fundamentally changed how America viewed warfare itself, because suddenly the greatest threat was no longer only rival superpowers. It was decentralized terrorist networks capable of striking unexpectedly across borders. In response, the United States launched the war in Afghanistan, targeting al-Qaeda and the Taliban government that sheltered them. And at first the campaign moved quickly, with American forces and allies overthrowing Taliban control within months. But what many expected to be a short operation evolved into a prolonged and difficult conflict lasting 2 decades, revealing once again that even the world's most powerful military can struggle against insurgency. Difficult terrain, political instability, and long-term nation-building challenges. Then in 2003 came another enormously controversial decision, the invasion of Iraq under President George W. Bush. based partly on claims that Saddam Hussein possessed weapons of mass destruction. And although Iraq's government collapsed quickly under American military pressure, the aftermath became deeply unstable, with insurgencies, sectarian violence, terrorism, and political chaos spreading throughout the country. And this war would become one of the most debated military interventions in modern history. What makes these conflicts so historically important is not only their immediate impact, but the long-term consequences they created. Because the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan reshaped global discussions about intervention, intelligence failures, counterterrorism, military occupation, and the limits of power itself. And they also influenced how other nations viewed American leadership, with some seeing the United States as a defender against terrorism, while others criticized aspects of its foreign policy and military strategy. At the same time, these wars transformed military technology and tactics dramatically, accelerating the use of drones, cyber operations, satellite surveillance, precision targeting systems, and special operations forces. And many modern security systems used globally today evolved directly from strategies developed during these conflicts. The wars also deeply affected American society itself because millions of veterans returned home carrying physical and psychological scars, while debates intensified about defense spending, military intervention, and America's global role. And this revealed another important truth about military history. Wars do not only change foreign regions, they reshape the nations fighting them internally as well. Meanwhile, the Middle East itself remained unstable, with power vacuums, extremist groups, regional rivalries, and ongoing conflicts continuing long after the initial invasions, and many analysts still debate whether these interventions ultimately increased long-term security or contributed to new forms of instability, proving once again that military actions often produce consequences lasting far beyond the battlefield. Another reason America's military history in the Middle East still shapes the world today is energy and trade security, because the region remains strategically important due to oil production, shipping routes, and geopolitical influence, meaning military decisions there affect global economics directly, including fuel prices, international markets, and diplomatic relationships worldwide. And perhaps the most astonishing part is this. After decades of conflict, the United States still maintains significant military influence across the Middle East through alliances, bases, intelligence cooperation, and strategic operations, demonstrating how military history creates long-term global commitments that rarely disappear quickly. So as this chapter closes, ask yourself something critical. When America intervenes militarily abroad, does it create greater global stability? Or does each intervention begin a chain of consequences impossible to fully control? Because in the next chapter, we will uncover how technology, cyber warfare, and modern military innovation are creating a new era where America's military influence extends far beyond traditional battlefields into space, information networks, and the digital world itself. This is American Global Force. Subscribe and share because the nature of warfare is changing again. And this time, the battlefield is no longer limited to oceans, deserts, jungles, or skies. It now exists inside computer systems, satellites, communication networks, artificial intelligence, and invisible streams of digital information flowing across the world every second. And once again, the United States stands at the center of this transformation, shaping how modern military power operates in ways most ordinary people barely notice. And this should immediately make you ask one unsettling question. If future wars can begin without a single soldier crossing a border, are we already living inside a new kind of global conflict without fully realizing it? For centuries, military power depended mainly on physical strength, armies, ships, tanks, aircraft, and territory. But as technology advanced during the late 20th and early 21st centuries, something revolutionary happened. Information itself became a weapon. And this completely changed how nations compete, spy, defend themselves, and attack rivals, because now disrupting a country's electrical grid, banking system, satellites, or communication networks can create chaos without firing traditional weapons at all. The United States recognized this shift earlier than many nations because of its enormous dependence on advanced technology, military communications, satellites, financial systems, and digital infrastructure. And military planners quickly understood a dangerous reality. The more technologically advanced the nation becomes, the more vulnerable it may also become to cyber attacks. And this realization pushed America into a new era of military strategy focused heavily on cybersecurity, intelligence gathering, and digital warfare. One major turning point came after the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001. Because as America intensified counterterrorism operations, worldwide intelligence agencies and military organizations expanded their surveillance and digital monitoring capabilities dramatically, using advanced technologies to track communications, analyze threats, and coordinate military operations globally. And while many leaders viewed these systems as necessary for national security, others worried about privacy, government power, and how far surveillance should extend in modern society. At the same time, rival nations also began investing heavily in cyber capabilities, including China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea, all recognizing that digital warfare could potentially weaken stronger opponents without requiring traditional military confrontation. And suddenly, the world entered a dangerous new competition where hackers, intelligence agencies, and cyber specialists became as strategically important as fighter pilots and naval commanders. Think about how strange this transformation really is. Because in earlier centuries, powerful nations displayed strength through visible armies and warships. But today, some of the most critical military operations happen invisibly inside networks ordinary people never see. And this creates a frightening reality. Countries can now attack each other silently through cyber operations while avoiding open warfare entirely. One example that shocked security experts was the discovery of highly sophisticated cyber tools capable of targeting industrial systems and nuclear infrastructure, proving that digital attacks could create real-world physical consequences. And this revealed something deeply unsettling about modern military power. Computer code itself could now damage factories, disrupt energy systems, and potentially threaten national security on massive scale. The United States responded by strengthening organizations like the United States Cyber Command, increasing investment in cybersecurity defense, digital intelligence, and offensive cyber capabilities, because military leaders understood future wars would likely involve simultaneous battles across land, sea, air, space, and cyberspace all at once. And this expanded definition of warfare changed military strategy forever. Another major transformation involved drones and remote warfare technologies, because during conflicts in the Middle East, the United States increasingly used unmanned aerial systems for surveillance and targeted operations, allowing military actions to occur across enormous distances without placing pilots directly in danger. And while supporters argued these systems improved precision and reduced troop casualties, critics raised ethical concerns about accountability, civilian risk, and the growing automation of warfare itself. Artificial intelligence is now pushing this transformation even further because military systems increasingly rely on machine learning, predictive analysis, automated targeting assistance, and advanced battlefield coordination technologies. And this raises another alarming question. What happens when machines begin playing larger roles in military decisions traditionally controlled by humans? Because history shows that technological revolutions in warfare often create consequences societies do not fully understand until much later. Space has also become a critical military domain, with satellites now essential for navigation, communication, intelligence gathering, missile detection, and global military coordination. And because the United States depends heavily on space-based systems, its military strategy increasingly focuses on protecting orbital infrastructure against potential threats, meaning the battlefield of the future may extend far beyond Earth itself. Meanwhile, misinformation and information warfare have become powerful modern weapons too, because influencing public opinion through digital platforms, propaganda campaigns, and online manipulation can shape elections, weaken trust, and destabilize societies without conventional invasion. And this means modern military competition now targets not only physical infrastructure, but also human perception itself. One reason America's military history still shapes the world today is because the United States often leads these technological military transitions, influencing how other nations respond, adapt, and compete globally, and whether through cybersecurity, drones, intelligence systems, or advanced surveillance networks, American military innovation frequently becomes a standard other countries study carefully. But despite all this technological advancement, one truth remains constant throughout history. Military power always creates both protection and fear simultaneously, because while advanced systems may deter enemies and strengthen national defense, they also increase global tensions by encouraging rivals to develop competing capabilities. And this cycle of competition continues driving international military development today. And perhaps the most astonishing reality is this. Many modern conflicts now occur constantly beneath public awareness through cyber intrusions, digital espionage, satellite surveillance, and information operations happening every day between major powers, meaning the world may already be experiencing forms of warfare far more continuous and complex than previous generations ever imagined. So as this chapter closes, ask yourself one chilling question. If future wars can begin through invisible attacks on networks, satellites, and information systems before ordinary people even realize conflict has started, how prepared is the modern world for the next stage of military history? Because in the next chapter, we will uncover how America's global military alliances and overseas bases continue shaping world politics today, and why some nations view that power as protection, while others see it as a growing threat. This is American Global Force. Subscribe and share, because one of the biggest reasons America's military history still shapes the world today is not only because of past wars, but because the United States built something no empire in history had ever fully achieved before: a worldwide military network stretching across continents, oceans, skies, cyberspace, and strategic regions. And whether people admire it, fear it, or criticize it, this global system continues influencing international politics every single day. And that should immediately make you ask one critical question. How did America become powerful enough to maintain military influence in so many parts of the world at the same time? The answer began after World War II, when much of Europe and Asia lay devastated, while America emerged economically stronger and militarily dominant. And during the following Cold War, the United States built alliances and military bases designed to contain Soviet expansion. But what started as temporary strategic positioning gradually evolved into a permanent global security structure, unlike anything previously seen in history. Today, American military bases exist across Europe, the Middle East, Asia, Africa, and the Pacific, allowing rapid deployment of forces almost anywhere on Earth. And this network gives the United States enormous strategic advantages because military aircraft, naval fleets, intelligence systems, and logistics operations can operate internationally with speed few other nations can match. And this explains why American military decisions often affect global events almost immediately. One of the most important alliances created during this expansion was NATO, formed originally to defend Western Europe against Soviet influence. And although the Cold War ended decades ago, NATO remains one of the most powerful military alliances in modern history, with member nations coordinating defense strategies, intelligence sharing, military exercises, and collective security commitments. And this alliance continues shaping international politics today, especially during tensions involving Russia and Eastern Europe. In Asia, the United States established strong military partnerships with countries like Japan and South Korea, partly because of conflicts during the Cold War and ongoing concerns about regional security, and these alliances remain extremely important today due to tensions involving China and North Korea, proving that military decisions made decades ago still influence current global power dynamics. But what makes America's military reach especially unique is not just the number of bases or alliances. It is the combination of military, economic, technological, and intelligence systems working together globally, because modern American power depends on interconnected networks involving satellites, naval fleets, cyber operations, air superiority, surveillance systems, and international logistics chains capable of supporting operations across enormous distances. Think about how extraordinary this really is, because throughout history, most empires struggled to maintain communication and control over distant territories. Yet modern American military systems can coordinate forces across continents within hours using advanced technology. And this capability has fundamentally changed how wars are fought and how nations calculate risk internationally. At the same time, this global presence creates enormous controversy, because while allies often see American military protection as stabilizing, critics argue that such widespread influence can increase dependency, provoke rivals, and encourage intervention in foreign conflicts. And this debate remains one of the central arguments in modern geopolitics. especially as rising powers challenge American dominance. One major example is the growing competition between the United States and China, because as China expands economically and militarily, many analysts now compare current tensions to earlier rivalries during the Cold War, especially in regions like the South China Sea and Taiwan Strait, where military positioning, naval operations, and strategic alliances are becoming increasingly important. And once again, America's historical military systems continue shaping modern global tensions. Meanwhile, the war in Ukraine revealed how deeply American alliances still influence international security, because U.S. military aid, intelligence support, and NATO coordination became central to the global response, demonstrating that military networks built after World War II still play major roles in modern conflicts, even decades after their creation. Another reason America's military history continues shaping the world is the dominance of the United States Navy, because control of global shipping routes remains essential for international trade and economic stability. And American naval fleets regularly patrol critical waterways such as the Persian Gulf, Pacific Ocean, and Mediterranean Sea, influencing everything from energy security to international commerce. The American military also maintains influence through humanitarian missions, disaster response operations, and strategic partnerships, meaning its role globally is not limited only to warfare. And this creates a complicated image internationally, because some nations see American military presence as protective and stabilizing, while others view it as excessive or politically motivated. Yet maintaining such enormous global influence comes with massive financial and political costs, because sustaining overseas bases, advanced technology, and worldwide military readiness requires enormous defense spending year after year, and debates continue inside America itself about whether such commitments remain necessary or sustainable in the long term. And perhaps the most fascinating reality is this: many people living ordinary daily lives around the world may not realize how deeply international stability depends on military systems and alliances created decades ago, because shipping routes, energy markets, communication systems, and regional security arrangements are all connected in some way to the global structure America helped build after its rise to power. But history also teaches something dangerous. Every dominant power eventually faces new challenges, rising rivals, internal pressures, and changing technologies. And the United States is no exception, because as global power shifts and new nations rise, the future of America's military influence becomes one of the most important questions of the 21st century. So as this chapter closes, ask yourself one final question before the ending begins. If America's military network has shaped the modern world for generations, what happens if that balance changes in the future? And more importantly, is the world prepared for what could come next? Because in the final chapter, we will uncover whether America's military influence is entering a new era of transformation, and what that could mean for the future of global power itself. This is American Global Force. Subscribe and share, because after everything we have uncovered, from the birth of the United States, through revolution, world wars, nuclear standoffs, Middle East conflicts, cyber warfare, and global military expansion, one final question now stands above all others. Can America continue holding the military influence that has shaped the modern world for generations? Or are we witnessing the beginning of a completely new era in global power? Because history teaches one powerful lesson repeatedly: no dominant force remains unchallenged forever. For more than a century, America's military history has influenced global politics, trade, technology, alliances, and security systems across nearly every continent. And for decades, many nations accepted one reality almost without question: when major crises erupted, the United States would almost certainly become involved, whether through military force, diplomacy, intelligence operations, economic sanctions, or strategic alliances. And this expectation itself became part of the international system, shaping how governments planned their defense strategies and foreign policies. But the modern world is changing rapidly, perhaps faster than at any point since the end of the Cold War, because new powers are rising, technology is evolving at extraordinary speed, and global competition is no longer limited only to tanks, ships, or missiles. It now involves artificial intelligence, cyber warfare, space systems, economic influence, rare earth resources, information control, and digital infrastructure. And this transformation is forcing military strategists everywhere to rethink what power truly means in the 21st century. One of the biggest challenges facing America today is the rise of China, whose rapid economic and military growth has created increasing tension with the United States across trade, technology, naval influence, and regional security, especially in the Pacific Ocean. And many analysts now compare this rivalry to earlier power struggles between rising and established nations throughout history because when one major power begins challenging another, global stability often becomes uncertain. The tension surrounding Taiwan has become especially important because the region sits at the center of strategic military calculations involving naval power, semiconductor technology, global trade routes, and international alliances. And this raises a chilling question. If a major conflict were ever to erupt between America and China, would the modern world be prepared for the economic and military consequences that could follow? At the same time, Russia continues challenging aspects of the post-Cold War international system, particularly through conflicts like the war in Ukraine, cyber operations, and military modernization. And this has pushed NATO to strengthen defenses and military coordination again, proving that even decades after the Soviet Union collapsed, the strategic systems built during the Cold War still heavily shape modern global politics. Meanwhile, completely new threats continue emerging beyond traditional warfare, including cyber attacks capable of targeting electrical grids, banking systems, hospitals, transportation networks, and satellites. And this means future wars may begin invisibly long before ordinary civilians fully realize what is happening. And perhaps that is one of the most frightening aspects of modern military history. The battlefield itself is becoming harder to define. Artificial intelligence is also transforming military strategy in ways that sound almost unbelievable, because nations are now developing autonomous drones, predictive battlefield systems, advanced surveillance networks, and machine learning technologies capable of analyzing enormous amounts of military data within seconds. And this raises another deeply unsettling question. What happens when military decisions increasingly depend on algorithms and machines rather than human judgment alone? Even space is no longer safe for military competition, because satellites now control navigation, communications, surveillance, intelligence gathering, and missile warning systems essential for modern defense operations, and major powers increasingly recognize that controlling space-based systems could determine future military superiority, meaning humanity may soon face strategic rivalries extending far beyond Earth itself. Yet despite all these challenges, the United States still possesses enormous advantages, including one of the world's strongest economies, unmatched military logistics capabilities, advanced technological industries, powerful alliances, and global naval reach, and perhaps most importantly, decades of experience operating internationally across different types of conflicts and strategic environments. And this combination continues making America one of the most influential military powers in modern history. But power itself creates pressure because maintaining worldwide military presence requires enormous financial resources, political unity, technological innovation, and public support. And inside America, debates continue growing over defense spending, foreign interventions, global responsibilities, and whether the country should remain heavily involved in international conflicts abroad. And these debates matter because history shows that internal divisions can weaken even the strongest powers over time. Another important factor is perception, because global influence depends not only on military strength, but also on credibility, alliances, diplomacy, and how other nations interpret American leadership. And this means future military power may rely as much on partnerships and international trust as on weapons themselves. What makes this moment in history so fascinating is that the world appears to be entering another transition period, similar to earlier moments when global power balances shifted dramatically. And those periods have often been dangerous because rising powers test existing systems, while established powers try to maintain influence, creating uncertainty that can easily lead to confrontation if managed poorly. Still, one truth remains undeniable. America's military history continues shaping the modern world because the systems, alliances, technologies, and strategies built over generations still influence international politics every single day. From NATO deployments in Europe to naval patrols in the Pacific, from cyber defense systems to intelligence sharing networks. And whether people support or criticize that influence, its global impact is impossible to ignore. And perhaps the greatest lesson of all is this: Military history is never truly only about weapons or battles. It is about power, fear, ambition, survival, technology, and the choices nations make when facing uncertainty. And the history of American military influence reveals how deeply those forces can shape humanity's future across generations. So now, as this final chapter closes, ask yourself one last question. Are we witnessing the continuation of America's long era of military dominance? Or are we standing at the beginning of a new global transformation that future generations will study the same way we now study the rise of past empires? Because the answer to that question may determine the future of the world itself. This is American Global Force. Subscribe, share, and stay informed. Because understanding history is not only about learning the past, it is about preparing for what may come next.